Kobach, who's now running for Senate. And Kansas has a very strict voter ID requirement. No photo ID, no vote. Very, very strict. And you see that in some of these other dark colored states as well. The others are somewhere in between. For example, some of these shaded states maybe require a photo ID but have provisions for you to cast a provisional ballot if you don't have one and come back with your ID. Or maybe they're a little bit looser in terms of what counts as an ID. Missouri just recently moved to photo ID, but traditionally Missouri required only ID, not photo ID. So for example, you could bring in a utility bill with your name and address on it. No photo, but that was okay. In truth, what these laws are designed to combat, which is called fraud by impersonation, claiming to be someone else and voting as that other person, is very, very rare, according to the research. Now, on the other hand, some of the criticisms are overblown too. The vast majority of voters do have some type of ID, and there's not a lot of evidence that these particular laws are having a widespread voter suppression effect. So it's an inconvenience to voters. Most voters, the vast majority, do come up with some ID. There's not much evidence of lower turnout, or another argument you hear that it hurts Democrats. There's not much evidence for that, but they're also probably not necessary. So we have inconvenient laws, but we are complying, but they're probably not necessary. Now, on voter suppression, there are some other laws that are of greater concern. So, for example, there's Kansas again, really standing out. It's one of the only dark-colored states in this particular map. And what we're looking at here now are proof of citizenship laws, and this map is definitely out of date because the Kansas law was declared unconstitutional and struck down by the federal courts in 2 cases in 2018. And I was an expert witness for the plaintiff in one of those 2 cases. But as of the 2016 general election, we had Kansas and Arizona with proof of citizenship laws in effect. You have to prove you're an American citizen by producing a birth certificate, passport, Native American tribal papers, or other ID in order to register to vote. Those did have a marked impact on lowering voter turnout. We lost about 30,000 people on the voter registries in Kansas because of these laws. And they also had some disproportionate effects. For example, there's a huge issue here, and it's a great issue for the League of Women Voters, I think, and that's poll worker training. Because one of the things we learned when we were investigating these proof of citizenship laws is there are the laws and then there are the poll workers. So a colleague of mine at Emporia State, who lives in Lawrence, for example, showed up to vote one day with his passport and was turned away. And that's not correct. Kansas law allows the passport as proof of citizenship. But he was being told that he had to have a birth certificate to register and a driver's license to vote. That's not correct. So the poll workers weren't trained properly. We also had some kind of heart-rending cases, I thought, when I testified before the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, some people from Native American communities that were turned away with their Native American tribal ID cards. However, the Kansas law states that that was valid proof of citizenship. So again, we have a problem with poll worker training. The poll workers kept saying birth certificate, and that's not correct. So not only were the laws rather onerous for some people, but the poll worker misunderstanding and misapplication of the laws was a problem as well. Now, some interesting states over here down south. We have 2 states, Alabama and Georgia, that passed these laws but never got to put them into effect. And they're probably a dead letter now because of the court ruling from Kansas in 2018. And then Tennessee has their own system. And what they do is they do not require you to prove citizenship, but they reserve the right to cross-check your citizenship with an INS database. Those are the only states doing anything with proof of citizenship. And like I say, Kansas, Arizona, Alabama, and Georgia, it's probably a dead letter right now because of that 2018 court ruling. So let's move on. This is, if you're worried about voters being disenfranchised, this is really where you need to look. And that is a felony disenfranchisement, very controversial, because we're talking about folks that have committed serious crimes, felony, not misdemeanor. And as you can see from this map, the states vary wildly in terms of how they handle the right to vote for people convicted of felonies. Up here in Vermont and Maine, I believe it is, in those two New England states, they set up absentee polling stations inside prisons. And the people who are incarcerated cast votes using, I believe, the address where they lived before they were incarcerated, not the location of the prison, as their home address. And by the way, locations of prisons can be a real issue for the census too. Where do you count the inmates as living for the census? But anyway, that's one example. Sorry about my dogs in the background. They're very excited. They get really excited about voting. And I'm just kidding. But anyway, that's one extreme. Then at the other extreme here, we have states like Georgia. You'll see Georgia as an outlier on the other end. And Florida, until a ballot initiative that passed a few years ago. And that's why you see Florida, that's a little different there from Georgia. Actually, even before that, they weren't quite as extreme as Georgia. But essentially, in those states, if you commit a felony, you lose your right to vote for the rest of your life unless you petition the governor individually and the governor restores it. And in some states, it's so restrictive that if you petition the governor once and you're rejected, you can't even reapply or appeal that ever. So essentially, most people convicted of felonies, even nonviolent felonies and so forth, lose their right to vote for life. Kansas is in between, unlike on some of the other maps. In Kansas, there is a process for restoration of voting rights. But this is another issue where we have laws and then we have implementation of the laws. In most states, like Kansas, you can get your right to vote restored once you've completed your sentence if you've been convicted of a felony. But most people who have been convicted of felonies don't know that. And they think that they've lost the right to vote for the rest of their lives, even though they haven't. And that tends to lead to very, very low voter turnout among that population. Unfortunately, because of the nature of, well, a whole bunch of different things. We could talk about that for hours. African Americans are disproportionately likely to be convicted of felonies. And so the effects of these laws are not neutral. They tend to significantly lower registration and voter turnout among African Americans, especially African American men. And that's, again, that's the laws themselves, but it's also the perception that you've lost your right to vote for the rest of your life, even if you actually haven't. Many people perceive it that way and are even told that by parole officers or election officials or their own attorneys, even if it's not true. So there's an information issue there too. And even in these states where one can petition for the restoration of the right, many people are not aware of it or don't try. Texas has been extremely aggressive about prosecuting people who vote after losing their right to vote due to a felony. And that may be having a suppressing effect on that population also. Okay, now let's dive in here to the next topic. Hang on just a second. Sorry about that. Give me just 2 seconds here. I want to talk about voter caging, and then we'll jump right into this paper trail stuff. But I want to talk a little bit about voter caging because that's another issue, and that one is one that is incredibly hard to pin down because you can't always catch state and local officials doing it. This is a very detailed map. I know you can't read all the notes. I'd be happy to send you a copy after the talk if you'd like. But essentially what we're seeing here is different laws and court rulings on voter caging in the states. And what you can see is the color coding, and it's our red states here where there has been some sort of action regarding voter caging. Well, what's voter caging? Voter caging is a tactic in which voters, usually in targeted precincts, not in the entire state and not even in the entire county, but targeted precincts, and often these precincts have large African American or Latino populations, Latina populations. Oftentimes we find them in inner cities. So if we're looking at Michigan, we might see them in Detroit. If we are looking at North Carolina, we might see them in Raleigh or in Charlotte or some of the other bigger cities. In Florida, we might see them in Tampa or Miami, not as much in the rural areas or even the suburbs. And what happens is that postcards are sent out by the election authorities stating that the postcard must be returned. And if the postcard is not returned, the person's voter registration will be canceled. And that is problematic because many people dismiss these postcards as junk mail. How many postcards do we receive every day that go straight into the recycling bin? And voting authorities often send out postcards that are reminders of upcoming elections. And you don't really need those because you can use your ID to vote. You don't need to keep that postcard if you already know your polling place. So people just pitch them. And so they get scooped up with the junk mail and tossed. The argument of the pro-voter caging folks, which are overwhelmingly Republican, is that people might abuse the process and stay on the voting rolls even though they've moved and they should have changed their voter registration, or they've died, or they've become ineligible. So we're just cleaning up the voter rolls. But in fact, nonpartisan groups like the Council of State Governments have much better ways to do that. For example, by cross-checking it with records of death certificates and things like that. Voter caging is particularly insidious, in my opinion, because it targets certain precincts. It's not a blanket citywide, countywide, or statewide. And some Republican officials have even acknowledged, look, we're trying to get African Americans and Latino voters off the voting rolls because they vote for Democrats. I'm pretty opinionated on this. I don't like it. And there have been various court rulings. Again, I know you can't see all the details. Not a big problem in Kansas. As you can see, Kansas is not highlighted. But you can also see some battleground states here. There's Pennsylvania, there's Ohio, there's Michigan, there's Wisconsin. A whole bunch of battleground states right there. Georgia is becoming a battleground. North Carolina is a battleground. Florida, of course, is a battleground. Arizona is becoming a battleground. And they all have this voter caging activity. There are just better ways to clean up the voter rolls. That's the bottom line, in my opinion. And finally, the good stuff, or maybe the bad stuff. What is going on right now with election security? I think the best way to do this might be to do it this way. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Mueller report. And I know the Mueller report is very controversial. The Mueller report stated a lot about possible involvement by either President Trump or candidate Trump at that time himself, members of his family, and people from his campaign team meeting with officials from the Russian government. Well, we know that they did. And we also know that the Russian government actively worked to sabotage US elections, both through spreading fake news on social media, particularly Facebook, and in some cases, even managing to hack into voting machines in US states, including Illinois and Florida. I'm not going to render the final judgment. Congress has rendered its judgment about if people from the Trump campaign connected the dots, if they knew that the Russians were doing this when they were meeting them. And of course, we know that President Trump was acquitted in the impeachment trial. So we're not going to go there. But my point here is, wherever you stand politically, there is no debate about the fact that the Russian government intervened in our elections. That's not controversial. We know this. The Chinese government is now working actively to intervene, not necessarily infiltrating voting machines as far as we know, but with fake social media posts about coronavirus. And these are documented, these are known, these are not rumors. Now, again, does that reflect on the Trump administration? I'm going to let you form your own opinion on that. But we do know that it's happening. So our concern, because we're working at the state level, is how do we secure our elections? Well, the good news, in some states, all voting machines are required to leave some type of paper trail. I'll zoom in a little bit here. 36 states and the District of Columbia, there's some kind of paper trail. And I know that with this note on here, you can't see the map. So let's give you a map with no note superimposed over it, and there it is. So good news, in these lighter colored state. Let's see. No, I'm sorry. Yeah, the blue states. The blue states, and that's not necessarily blue as in Democratic voting, just blue on this map. We're in pretty good shape here because those states, their voting machines leave some type of paper trail to verify and validate votes. Now, we can go even further than a paper trail, but this is a good start. However, we have some problems here. One problem is, as you'll see, Kansas is not one of the blue states. So in other words, Kansas allows voting machines which leave no paper trail whatsoever for potential recounts. In addition, there is some question, and this has come up in Kansas, as to whether or not a paper trail is enough. My own personal opinion is that we need more, because if you have an election machine that has been tampered with, sure, it will leave a paper trail saying this is how the vote was cast, but how do we verify that that actually reflects what the voter intended? In other words, you could have somebody fooling with the votes on the voting machine, and then on the paper trail, you compare the paper trail readout to the voting machine, and it looks fine. But if that fooling around with the voting machine happened in real time, we still have a problem. So my own personal opinion is a paper trail is not good enough. I think all voting should be by paper ballot. I think that the paper ballot should be recorded with optical scan readers that are never connected to the internet. And then I think the results can be tabulated. And I have no problem with people posting election results on the internet. But I do not believe, I believe that the ballot itself should be paper, except for people with disabilities. Electronic voting machines are great for people with disabilities. So have one in the precinct for people with certain disabilities. Everybody else, paper ballot, read it with an optical scan reader, never, ever, ever connected to the internet for any reason ever. Don't even have a port on there to connect it to the internet. I have no problem using electronics to read ballots. Electronically reading ballots is actually more accurate than hand counting. But that equipment should not involve the internet, just a machine that reads the ballots. And then you have paper ballots there for a recount if you need them. So that's my rant about that. But at least in these blue-colored states, we're leaving a paper trail. But then we see states like Kansas here that are not blue, not to mention some pretty big states. Oops, sorry about that. Oops, wrong map. Hang on. Let me show that just another second here. Texas, second most populated state in America. Florida, third most populated state in America. And look at that. They don't mandate that their voting machines leave a paper trail, and that's a lot of voters. Pennsylvania, battleground state, one of America's larger states, no paper trail. And so that's rather disturbing. And then you have weak paper trail laws in states like Ohio, Illinois, and Wisconsin. And the voter machines that actually were accessed by the Russian government, they were in Illinois and Florida. And as you can see, those are not coded blue on this map. What about the states that do not mandate a paper trail? Well, you can see the caption here. 14 states used paperless machines in 2018. And I know you can't see the states, so let me show you another map with no markings on it. There's a clean map for you. And so the states we're worried about here, the most worried about, as I say, I'm not satisfied that a paper trail is enough, but it's a start. But the states we're most worried about are these dark colored states, 14 of them, right here. And as you can see, there's Kansas right there. Also, America's second and third most heavily populated states, Texas and Florida, and America's eighth most heavily populated state, Georgia. And another one of the biggest states in the United States, Pennsylvania, all are in the danger zone here using paperless machines. And so what do we do about that? Well, the states could change the laws, but in addition to that, let me see, what's this one? Okay, here's what we can do right here. Some of those states, see there, some of those states have fully or partially switched to paper-based voting since then. So as you can see, Florida down here, Florida is moving in what, in my opinion, is the right direction, switching to paper-based voting. You'll also note, sorry about that, you'll also note that you have these states where it's spotty, and that's because things are happening with counties. And we're going to look at that here in a minute. But here's some good news. America's third most populated state, the home of the 2000 recount and all those problems, is switching to paper-based voting. And this is modern paper-based voting. Those old punch cards with the hanging chads, those are obsolete. They don't use those anymore. So we don't always hear good election news out of Florida, but this is a very positive development. What about the other states? Well, we've got to get that late map to see the other states. So let's do that right now. Here it is. Here's where we're going. So here we see the states that are switching. And you see Florida, which for the most part has switched, but notice there are a few areas of light green or white. So the entire state of South Carolina is in the process of switching, but you see a lot of this checkerboard pattern right here with the switching. And what you're seeing there is that it's up in these states, and Kansas is one of them. There's Kansas. It's up to the counties. So let's zoom in on Kansas. And there you go. It's up to the counties in states like Kansas and Texas and even Florida, although most Florida counties have switched. But there's Kansas right there. And as you can see, most of Kansas is using paper-based voting now. And that includes the state's largest counties. Sedgwick County is, I believe that's Sedgwick, is dark green, paper-based. Johnson County, dark green, paper-based. That over there is Miami County, not Johnson. Wyandotte, Douglas, your home county of Shawnee, Lyon County, where I work, they're all dark green. So for those of us advocates of paper-based voting, this is great news. But you'll also notice some holes. Some counties are in the process of switching with the light green, and some have not switched at all with the white. So in these states, and then again, I'll go back to this map right here. In these states, they're really putting it on the counties to get switched over. And so like here's battleground Pennsylvania right here, and look at how much variation there is. You've got everything from light green down around here around Philadelphia, dark green around Pittsburgh, a population center, but then you've also got a lot of white in rural Pennsylvania. So that could affect the election results coming up. And so hang on just a second. I'm back. And so that's what I have to say. I hope you found that useful in some ways. And if you want to talk or have any questions, we can do that now.
Okay, I've given everybody the ability to unmute yourself for questions. However, I think it would be useful so that we don't all kind of walk on each other, since we have 25 participants. If you could either raise your hand or wave in your box, and then I or Michael can recognize you, and you can unmute yourself and ask your question. So, are there any questions?
I'm raising my hand. This is Grace Wilson. Is there any argument to be made that paper ballots are safer than using a voting machine based on the virus and how long it would stay on the machine or on paper or whatever?
That's a good question. I'm not a doctor, and I don't even play one on TV. But I think that my understanding, just as a layperson, is the primary threat from the virus is the person-to-person transmission. And so where that comes up is crowding together in line at the polling places. So that's a whole other issue that I might have addressed, is the issue of there are folks, and I'm one of them, that would like to see us switch as quickly as possible and as completely as possible to voting by mail this year. And there are those that do not advocate that. But voting by mail would certainly help a lot with the crowding together at the polling places. Now, people can exercise their right to vote absentee, and all states but one, Missouri, All states but one have early voting, which will help. But voting by mail, which the Kansas Democrats did in their primary this year, is probably the best way to reduce person-to-person transmission at the polling place. Now, as far as how long the virus lives on paper and also how long it lives on those touch screens, I don't know. That's outside my area of expertise.
I just was going to comment that our the state League of Voters, that our state League of Voters president has sent a letter to all the county clerks explaining that Kansas Statute 25-622 allows the Secretary of State, Schwab, to declare an emergency and require that all county election offices send all Kansans a mail-in ballot. And we're concerned, there's been 4 counties, I believe, that have, the election officials have sent something to every registered voter, an application for mail-in ballot. Well, then their county, election office workers will have to match all these up, send something back. Will take quite a bit of time for the election workers. Whereas if the Secretary of State would declare this emergency and send mail-in ballots to everyone, you could avoid all that, extra staff time. Anyway, that's the end of my comment.
So I think
that's a really good point.
I think Evelyn had her hand up next.
Yes, I just wanted to ask about those who had been sentenced and were now free. When I was doing I answered questions for the Kansas Democratic Party during the mail-in ballot period. And I had a gentleman ask me if he could vote. He was a felon, but he was not even on probation. He was through with all of that. And I knew that he was eligible to vote, but I knew he had to jump through some hoops. So perhaps the professor could tell us, what should I have told him? How does he jump through those hoops?
I would contact either your own lawyer or the ACLU on that one.
Okay.
This is a bit of an aside. It's a whole other topic, but I also recommend if anyone ever is facing any felony charges, I would mortgage the farm if I had to hire a private defense attorney instead of relying on a public defender. It's a whole other topic, but public defenders are overworked, they're underpaid. In Missouri, they're actually suing the state because they're funded so little. So I would hope that your contact you've made has, and they're expensive, and a lot of felony defendants are indigent. But I hope he or she has been able to secure a private defense attorney and not a public defender. And they can work with that person. And then another outlet, if that doesn't work, or if you need a plan B, would be the ACLU.
Okay, thank you. That helps.
You're going to need a lawyer to do it.
Okay.
I think Leslie's next.
Actually, I just want to partially answer that question. We have a PowerPoint that we presented in a halfway house. So we did research on the laws in Kansas on felons being allowed to vote, and it's actually automatic. And in Shawnee County, anyway, they know that. And they get a report of the people that become felons, and they mark their registration. So felons have to re-register, and then they will go in as, and they have to be completely through all parole, probation, all of that. They don't have to pay fines yet in Kansas, but it's automatic that they are allowed to vote once they're through that, but they do have to re-register even if they were registered before. So once they re-register, that goes in and there's no information that they're a felon, and they are made a registered, their application will be accepted as.
Leslie, they do have to pay their fines or not?
No, not here, not yet. Now that's I mean, they could have had a case maybe that said that, but that's Florida that's doing that goofy thing, and doesn't look like that's going to last. So that's not a requirement in Kansas. They just have to get through probation, parole, whatever was part of the sentence. And once that's done, they're automatically eligible to register to vote. They just have to register. And we, like I said, we have a PowerPoint. If you know some prison or halfway house that wants us to present, we're willing to do that. We did that in the federal system.
So that would be, you said you knew that was true in Shawnee County. Do you know whether that same procedure is true in every county?
Well, it's based on state law, so it should be the same.
Okay, should be. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Sometimes we do hit a problem, as I mentioned, and on some of the other laws with the implementation.
Right.
And again,
there's what the law says and what the counties do, but that's good news about Shawnee County.
Okay.
Other questions? I do have a question. One of the things that's kind of been keeping me up at night about the upcoming primary is that vote by mail does not, it still requires voter ID. Just like you show your driver's license when you go in to vote, you have to document your ID and vote by mail. And for those who don't have a driver's license, that's going to require some type of additional step to vote by mail. So I just wondered if you, Dr. Smith, could comment about the voting laws that are really going to make vote by mail difficult.
I don't know. I don't know. As far as I know, I don't think the Secretary of State could suspend the other voting laws. It'd simply declare the election to be vote by mail. And I suspect that whatever happens, it would almost certainly land in court. But my intuition is that we're stuck with them, but I certainly defer to someone that's more knowledgeable about it than me.
Yeah. So, other questions?
I have just a question, and I'm not sure if anyone knows the answer. Maybe you do, Dr. Smith. But so this last week, the 10th Circuit affirmed that the documentary proof of citizenship is indeed not constitutional. However, the law is still it's on the books in Kansas. So what can we do now besides, of course, we're going to talk to our senators and representatives about getting that off the books, but what do you think the chances are of that actually happening?
I think they're minimal. The Republican Party's base probably wants the laws on there, and the Republicans running to be renominated to run for re-election are likely not to want to touch that issue. If anything, the courts have given them a great gift by the courts handling it, so the legislature doesn't have to. One place you could look is Secretary of State Schwab's office, because I remember after the Fish v. Kobach and the Nosik v. Kobach cases were decided, Kobach was nearing the end of his term. And of course, one of the big issues was, would Scott Schwab's office take over what Kobach had been doing, which, and I think you know this, but Kobach was very, very unusual in his behavior, in that typically, if you see any kind of voter fraud issues, those are referred to the state attorney general's office, local election authorities, or federal authorities. Kobach was one of the only secretaries of state in America who was prosecuting them himself. So the thinking was, well, if Schwab would just back off, that would be one way to go. And I believe what happened is that some of that was referred to Attorney General Schmidt's office. And so I don't see the legislature repealing the law. But what could happen is that if the Secretary of State and the Attorney General agree to just kind of let it go, stop appealing the rulings, just drop it, that would actually, I think, be a more likely outcome.
Well, and that is indeed what the League of Women Voters is actually doing. We're asking our members to do that now. So that's our next step. But the Secretary of State has not been very interested in talking to us in the past. So not even the new one. So we keep doing it, but you're right. It's tricky, very tricky.
Yeah, it really is. Even some of the moderate Republican legislators are concerned about their base. And so I suspect that if the law can't be enforced right now anyway, they might be tempted to just leave it alone.
I think Gwen had a question.
No, I don't believe so. Thanks.
Okay, all right, thanks.
That's right.
Any other questions? Do we have any league announcements? Well, we're going to try to do virtual Tuesday topics with Burdette Loomis in June, and I think the date is Tuesday, June the 2nd. So stay tuned. You know, in a part of this transition in life, you know, we're communicating differently because of the voter, which, by the way, looked absolutely wonderful.
Yeah.
And thank you very much, Ginger. And so, you know, in order to protect privacy of that Zoom link, we've kind of buried it a little bit in the voter. So it does require you to kind of look for it and manage it and know when it is. However, I have recorded this Tuesday topics, and at some point in the near future, it will be posted on the library website. So we still have our collaboration with the library going. So watch your email, and we'll communicate with you about June Tuesday topics and other activities and where you can get involved. So is there anything else?
I just thought of an announcement, just a reminder that the state council meeting is on Saturday. You can still register. There's a link in the last, in the May voter notes, right, Jackie? Anyway.
There's a link on our website. That's the easiest way to get it, Grace. Just go to lwvk.org and there will be a link.
There is a link in our voter as well. So
okay, thank you. And we think we figured out a voting system so that we can actually, you know, find out with, you know, delegates voting, you know, others are welcome to join, whether you're a delegate or not. I think these Zoom meetings are a really welcome thing when we're all cooped up the way we are. It's really nice to see everybody's face.
Yeah, yeah, yep. I even combed my hair this morning, so. So, okay, thank you so much.
And thanks again to Professor Smith. It's very nice to have this.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for being our experimental speaker here.
Great.